Hi. I'm Russell Newcombe, and I've been working in the drugs field for about 30 years now. I'm not very good with my hands. So I've been independent now for about 4 years, running a drugs research and training agency called 3D Research. And a lot of my work at the moment is around novel psychoactive substances, or legal highs, as they used to be called. And the other area I've been doing some work in is for the INPUD, the international network of people who use drugs. Some of the work I've been doing for INPUD over the last year, I finished it about a year ago, so I've had to come back to it and read what I wrote again this week. We asked me to do a review of the international literature on discrimination against people who use drugs, discrimination and hate, I guess you could say, towards drug users. INPUD prefers to call these people who use drugs, but then that gets shortened to the acronym PUDs, or if it's people who inject drugs, it becomes PIDs. So I'm going to generally stick with drug users, but there might be a few PUDs on some of the slides, and maybe the occasional PID. INPUD, I produced this report for them about a year ago, and I first started doing work in this area about 20 years ago when I wrote an article called Second Class Citizens, which looked at discrimination against drug users in the UK. And a year ago, when INPUD hired me to do this, I did a bigger review of the international literature on discrimination and hate towards drug users. They're still holding this report at the moment while they get a panel to look at it, and they want to use this review of the literature on discrimination against drug users to develop a charter of rights for people who use drugs, and obviously that will be linked both to a harm reduction agenda and the drug policy reform agenda. Okay, so what do we mean by intoxiphobia? Well, there isn't really a good word for discrimination against people who use drugs, and I don't think intoxiphobia is necessarily the right word for it, but it's certainly a starting point, and it might be a good stimulus for somebody to come up with a better term if this isn't the right one. But basically what we mean by intoxiphobia, what I mean by it, is negative attitudes and behaviour, both from organisations and individuals towards users of prohibited drugs. We could also say that's towards users of legal or licensed drugs too, as we saw from Jerry Stimpson earlier saying e-cig users are now starting to experience certain kinds of discrimination, particularly from various health authorities. But today I'll be focusing mainly on prohibited drugs. And intoxiphobia is it's a term similar to sexism or racism in its meaning, but you can't really get one for drug user out of that. Pudism doesn't sound too good, or drug userism. So I look for a word with the same structure as homophobia, with discrimination and hate towards gay people. I also try and avoid the word stigmatisation, but a lot of the literature uses it, so it can't always be avoided. But I think we need to avoid that term because it kind of focuses on the attributes of drug users, the sort of shame of the stigma of being a drug user, rather than focusing on the people who do the discrimination, the discriminators themselves. So as well as intoxiphobia, I think discrimination is a more morally sound term to use here than stigmatisation, which focuses too much on drug users and the shame they're supposed to carry for what they do. This is just a little bit of the history and theory behind this idea. We can see that over a long period now, over a century, various minority groups have had to try and gain legal rights in the UK and other parts of the world. This focuses here on the UK, and we can see that early women's movements, from the suffragettes right through to the women's liberation movement, have helped develop this idea of sexism as a discrimination against women in particular, but it can also be seen as discrimination against men in a much lesser sense than women experience it. There's also racism, and again, various groups have emerged over the years which have helped develop that idea as a concept of a much clearer idea than we have with intoxiphobia, of racism against minority groups, particularly black and Asian people. And then the same with gay people. A number of movements over the years, starting I think with the homophile movement back in the 40s, started then, and more recently the Gay Liberation Front, Outrage and so on, helped introduce this term homophobia, which is discrimination and hate against gay people from various sources. So with drug users we have Intoxiphobia, and various organisations like Release, Transform, the pro-legalisation group in Britain, or legal regulation as they prefer, have helped us understand more about how drug users are discriminated against in society, much further and beyond just being criminalised for drug use. That is part of it, but it goes way beyond that. And as I said, the International Network of People Who Use Drugs are now one of the main groups in Britain and around the world who are trying to get more attention to this idea of drug users being discriminated against purely because they're doing something that the majority of people perhaps in society aren't doing. And intoxiphobia is a good starting word for having one word for what all that's about. In the UK then, just to focus on the UK a little, which I'm obviously more familiar with, the 98 Human Rights Act is applicable only to public bodies such as government departments, local authorities and criminal justice agencies, and it implements the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. And there's a lot more of this in the report I've given to input, and hopefully that'll be released when they've processed it a bit more sometime in 2015. But the UK now also has specific laws preventing discrimination by individuals on the grounds of people's sex, race and disability, and since 2006 age as well. And from 2004 we've seen laws emerging relating to discrimination on the grounds of religion or sexual orientation in the fields of education and employment. So some of these discrimination laws are restricted to certain areas. But drug users are still getting laws which primarily discriminate against them rather than any anti-discrimination laws to protect them. So firstly then, organisational discrimination. Discrimination against drug users comes from many sources, including international bodies, government departments, criminal justice system, health services, and local authorities and various other agencies. The targets of discrimination, obviously they have to know you're a drug user to discriminate against you, and it's mainly done by identifying someone as a person who uses drugs by 4 official recording systems: medical records, which can make you an addict, criminal records, which can make you a drug offender, various social records, and something we've become more familiar with over the last few years, government security records, which would be the NSA in the USA and GCHQ here, which keep very detailed information on people's criminal activities, including drug use. Research is also showing now that the impact of organisational discrimination on the lives of people who use drugs is significant, and it affects their mental health, physical health and social well-being. So before I get into giving a quick overview of some of the main literature which shows the nature and extent of discrimination against drug users on the planet, I'll just go over a couple of studies which do show that what this impact of discrimination against drug users is, and it's not just hurting people's feelings or even worse, giving them a criminal record. As you'll see, there's a lot more to it than that. Latkin and colleagues in 2013 gave stigma and depression scales to 340 people who had used cocaine, crack or heroin in the prior 6 months in Baltimore in the USA, and stigma was found to be significantly associated with high levels of depression. So that's a first study which found what some of the unpleasant effects of discrimination are if you're a drug user. Then Lloyd in 2013 conducted a systematic review of the literature on stigmatization of problem drug users, to use their phrase, and they identified 185 papers for this review. And Lloyd concluded that stigmatizing attitudes towards drug users were common amongst both the general public and non-specialist professionals, and that their impact on people who use drugs was profound. Obviously, I can't go into all the details of these studies here today, but if anyone wants to email me, the email address will be on the end of this presentation. I can send you some of the information which is available so far, but not the whole input report just yet. And then a couple more studies showing the impact of discrimination. Young and colleagues in 2005 conducted a study of the minority population of drug users in the USA and found that they reported discrimination due to drug use was the most common type of discrimination which they'd experienced, and that's across a lot of different types of groups of people, and also that it was a type which had most impacted on their lives. And then lastly, from this bunch of studies, Ahern and colleagues in 2007 interviewed and assessed the health of over 1,000 illicit drug users, and they found discrimination and alienation were both statistically associated with poorer mental health, and discrimination was also associated with poorer physical health. So there can be no question, really. That's just a selection of some of the main studies which have shown what the impact of discrimination against drug users can be. And I know that people who've suffered discrimination in other areas, as we saw earlier, will be able to relate to some of that. Okay, what are these 10 areas of intoxiphobia then? Well, this literature review I did identified 10 main areas. I'll just go over what they were with you before looking at some of the main literature which is focused on this and which underlies this list. Firstly, employment. We have exclusion and dismissal from employment for drug users and unfair drug testing. I'll look at some of that soon. Secondly, in the welfare area, we're seeing drug testing of claimants in some countries and restrictions on welfare for people identified as using drugs. Thirdly, in the area of education, students can be suspended or excluded from school for using drugs, and in some countries like the USA, you can experience restricted grant or loan eligibility if you're identified as a drug user in different ways. In the area of travel, you can have refusal of a travel visa, constraints on prescriptions, and passport confiscation in different parts of the world are all used. Fifthly, in the area of housing, refusal of tenancy applications to convicted drug users and eviction of tenants who commit drugs offences or involved in other drug incidents. 6, in the area of finances, banks can refuse loans and other companies can refuse financial contracts on the grounds, for instance, that you're a convicted drug trafficker, and you can also have your life insurance rejected if there's any evidence you're an injecting drug user. 7, in the area of driving, in some countries they'll remove your driving license, sometimes for long periods for drug driving offences, sometimes justified, sometimes not. And also invalidation of insurance can be linked to that too. 8, when it comes to children, we're seeing more and more now prosecution of mothers for using drugs whilst they're pregnant or child rearing, removal of children, and also restrictions on access to children for separated and divorced parents, and restrictions on adoption. 9, in the area of criminal justice, and 10 in the area of health services, a whole range of forms of discrimination, criminal justice, victimless crimes, conspiracy and incitement charges, discredited evidence, confiscation of assets, and so on. I'll come back to some of these, all forms of discrimination in criminal justice areas. And with health and helping services, we see all around the world lots of examples of unfair and restricted drug treatment practices, enforced treatment, coerced treatment, and inadequate access to services, including harm reduction and services related to prevention and treatment of bloodborne viruses. So there's a little summary of that. Those are the 10 areas in which this review of the literature found discrimination against drug users in several countries usually, and sometimes most of them. Okay, this review of the literature then, obviously in the time available today, we can't go over, there were over 100 key relevant publications and reports, and when I first started doing these literature reviews in this area about 20 years ago, there's only a dozen or so studies, so this whole area has expanded massively. There's a lot more information and research around now about this area. Most of these studies were assessing national and organisational policies towards drug users, or they were reviews of areas of the relevant literature. And given the time I've got, I'll focus on one salient subgroup of these papers, which are probably the best bunch for today's purposes. And those are the studies which have assessed multiple types of discrimination against drug users in one or more countries. So here's the first couple of those. This was a study that some of you may know, and one of the better known studies in this area. They didn't call it Intoxiphobia, I'm calling it that. It was a study of intoxiphobia in Australia in 1999. Lenton and his colleagues in assessed 68 West Australians with one conviction for cannabis possession. So, it's pretty much as low level as it can be for being a drug offender, I think, which is why one of the reasons why they chose it, apart from that being one of the larger groups of users. And they concluded that, to quote them, this can have a real and detrimental impact on people's lives. Just one conviction for cannabis. That's something I've experienced myself. Been excluded from several jobs for having a cannabis conviction when I was a student about 300 years ago, and it was 30, which was long enough. And also been banned from travelling to the USA for having the criminal gall to give some cannabis to a friend when I was a student. So 10 years after their single cannabis conviction, after 10 years up to it, a third had experienced one or more negative employment consequences. 1 in 5 had been refused a job. About 1 in 6 had been dismissed from jobs because of that cannabis conviction. 1 in 3, again, a third, reported it had led to further involvements in the criminal justice system, for instance, being investigated by the police. 1 in 5 reported at least one negative effect on their relationships. About 1 in 6 reported at least one negative effect on accommodation, and 7% at least one negative effect on international travel. That was Australia. This study was done in the USA, called Collateral Sanctions for Cannabis Offences. Again, this one looks at cannabis in 2007, and it was reported that the USA's 50 states have many collateral sanctions for people convicted of both misdemeanor cannabis offences, notably possession, and also felony cannabis offences such as growing and supplying. And I'll just go through the ones that the majority of states come up on for this. Bars on voting in the USA, they can ban you from voting for having a cannabis offence, and 47 states ban cannabis offenders from voting. Restrictions on access to public housing for at least 3 years, misdemeanor or felony, 46 states doing that. Exclusion from adopting children, 38 states do that for a misdemeanor cannabis offence. Barriers to education, you can lose your educational aid, financial aid for a year in 28 states for a cannabis offence. Suspension of driver's licence for 6 or more months in 21 states, and so on. This study by Jurgens and their colleagues in 2010 reviewed evidence from over 900 studies, so this was a big literature review, examining the impact of violations of drug users' human rights on both their risk of HIV and their access to services. And they found that there were 4 key harm reduction violations identified: denial of harm reduction services, restricted access to antiretroviral therapy, abusive law enforcement practices, and coercive drug treatment regimes. And a lot of other studies looking at this area have come up with the same list and more. And this study found that violations of drug users' human rights were widespread. They increased vulnerability to HIV infection and negatively affected delivery of HIV prevention and treatment services. And this study concluded that protection of the human rights of people who use drugs is important because it's an essential precondition to improving the health of people who use drugs. 5 minutes. Wow. Lastly then, nearly at the end anyway, Human Rights Watch, a major organisation in this area, identified 6 areas of human rights violations towards drug users. Just very quickly, lethal criminal justice practices. 33 governments retain the death penalty for drugs offences. Violence by the police, and there's a whole list of awful case studies here in this study. Beatings, forced detoxification, and torture in countries like Bangladesh, Canada, Kazakhstan, Russia, Thailand, and Ukraine. Imprisonment, many countries still jailing drug users for possession. Deprivation of treatment, there's no or little opiate substitution treatment, needle exchange, and so on in a whole list of countries you can see there. Just as examples, they're not the only ones, they're just some of the worst offenders. Incarceration and cruelty by drug treatment agencies in those listed countries. And 6, lack of access to controlled medicines. Many countries have restrictions on opiates in hospitals, and cannabis is rarely available as a medicine. That's one of the studies from the Human Rights Watch. There's many on their website if you want to go and have a look. That one's called "They Treat Us Like Animals," quoting one of their research respondents in Cambodia. Okay, so what does all this mean? Well, the At the end of this review of the literature, I suggested that drug users have 10 fundamental rights. Maybe we'll have some time to talk about these later. I can only quickly go over them in the time that's left. But they include, and certainly these are things that need debating, as the rights of people who use drugs, and a lot of it will depend on legal changes, the right to consume drugs, the right to possess and store drugs, the right to safer drug products, the right to share drugs, the right of access to drug-taking equipment, the right to information on safer drug use, the right to be fairly described, and the right to criminal justice, the right to health and helping services, and the right to social inclusion, not being excluded from travel, employment, and so on, because you have a drug conviction or you've been in treatment for a drugs offence. What does it all mean then? Well, bringing an end to discrimination against drug users is going to involve a lot of effort, but there's 4 main steps that are definitely needed. We need a lot more research into the nature, prevalence and consequences of discrimination against drug users, public campaigns to educate people about users' rights, legal challenges to drug laws and policies under human rights legislation, and obviously new revised laws and policies to protect the rights of drug users and protect them from discrimination. I'll just skip a few slides there, and there was a little summary page there, which if you want this thing, I guess it will be appearing on the HIT website, and you can also email me for this presentation if you want the full thing. But as I say, I'm doing a lot of work for the International Network of People Who Use Drugs. I'm also a member. I used to be on their board, but that was far too political for me. I'll leave that to others. The main aims of input, they have others, but the 5 main aims relating to discrimination against drug users in particular they are the main international organisation representing drug users. They advocate and lobby at international level for the rights of people who use drugs. They advocate for intermediate reforms to drug laws to reduce stigmatisation. They promote harm reduction. They promote effective health and support services for people who use drugs. And they support activists who advocate for the rights of people who use drugs. And that's all. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much.